Have you seen the new dietary guidelines? Because we have, and we have thoughts. But before we get into what's actually wrong with them, we want to talk about something bigger. The environments that made a bad set of guidelines not just possible, but almost inevitable. And that's the culture of food fear. And we're all swimming in it right now. Welcome to Bite of Mind, the podcast where nutrition and mental health meet. We are two registered dietitians breaking down how nutrition and food actually impact our mood, focus, and our overall well-being. So my name is Rachel Robinson, and I am joined by my co-host,
Ilkay Bashesky.
So let's get into it.
So one of the reasons why I really wanted to discuss this topic with you is because I was just questioning this. Like, how come an advice that is so scary has this much effect on human beings? You know me. Sometimes I like to ask some existential questions. So that's why it was just one of those moments as a dietitian. I was questioning that. Stuff like seed oils are poisonous or raw milk cures everything. Of course, you know the general idea with how gluten is toxic or like, ultra processed can kill you. I was just kind of familiar with those because it's like, oh, cancerous, you know
Yeah,
from
yeah.
before, but, like, I was just kinda thinking, like, what is causing people to feel like this? Why are they really taking these kind of advices so seriously to the point that they wanna live their life by that rule?
Well, and it's so interesting too because I feel like you hop on social media and yeah, everyone's screaming everywhere like everything is toxic. And it's like there is a kernel of real science or truth in some things where like we do
Yeah.
know, right? Like a diet high in heavy ultra processed foods is associated with some worse health outcomes. But what
Mhm.
happens is I think people see this one little thing where they see maybe some research or a finding or an article saying like this could potentially be bad for you, and they just sprint miles past this and they instantly jump to this conclusion that you can never eat this ever again. Like they completely ignore any nuance or moderation or balance in anything. It's now everyone's screaming from the rooftops, this is poisonous, this is toxic, this is going to kill you. So it's
Yeah.
like this pattern of like real concern, exaggerated claim, moral panic online. And then, without a doubt, every single time I see this too, and I don't know if you see this, there is somebody that comes out and monetizes this. They're like, I have a supplement that will cure you, or here's my plan, my meal plan. Go buy this. This will, completely help you and reshape your entire life and balance your hormones. And social media is that like accelerant to the fire.
Mhm. Absolutely. Like, I remember seeing this one post. It was about, like, the carnivore diet, and then usually, yes, you're absolutely right with those kinda are you feeling constantly fatigued or tired? So maybe you should be doing a carnivore diet and then follow
Hmm.
our program or buy my program so I can just give
Yes.
you, like, this, new diet plan where you can have less inflammation, which is the contrary of the research that we're reading, about, red meat
Mhm.
and inflammation. But yeah, I mean, it can be very harmful at the end of the day, like having those kind of things, those kind of information for someone who's going through so much with, I don't know, cholesterol problems or hyperlipidemia or high blood pressure, then it can become like a concern for health concern
Mhm.
for that person to follow
Mhm.
that kind of unhealth advice from
Mhm.
social media accounts like that.
No, 100%. And I think that's where it's important to also step back and like understand and recognize like a lot of this is coming from very valid like health concerns that people may have, right? Like the carnivore diet, I think picked up because you're seeing a lot of people go, well, I maybe have uncontrolled blood sugars and I want to be able to help correct this, or maybe I'm having some GI upset and I want to help correct this. And, they have this concern, right? But then you see people online who are like, okay, well, we know to help with our blood sugar, we have to manage like maybe carbohydrate intake. So then they go to the
Mhm.
absolute extreme and go, we must never eat a carbohydrate ever again. They're all toxic. And then these people who maybe have this concern see that and they're like, oh, that person must be right because that makes sense in my mind. And like, I don't really necessarily know much about this. So I'm going to trust this. And oh, look, they're selling me a plan. They're going to walk me through it. Right. And it's this
Mhm.
cycle, but it's like, it's not just annoying for us, but it can be really harmful to people. Like when we talk
Yeah.
about food fear as like an information problem and we think like, oh, if we just give people the right nutrition facts, like they'll relax, they'll figure it out. But like that's not actually the case because all this fear around food isn't just intellectual. It's not just like what we know, right? It's psychological. It
Emotional.
preys on, yeah, it's emotional. Preys on these psychological, emotional feelings and fear that people have.
Yes, absolutely. We're going to continue to investigate it a little bit more, but plus I feel like the fear is also coming from the unknown, when we don't know
Mhm,
something and somebody tells us something that like something about something we don't know, then it
mhm.
becomes like this thing in our mind. I think one of the biggest examples is definitely like there is like these bigger guys or deep state kind of topics.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
I'm sure,
Yep.
like, there are certain things that I believe I think human beings are definitely thirsty of power, and when we can have the power, we wanna have it as much as we can. So, some of the things are definitely believable, but I think that's one of the stuff that I like evil industries that makes you sick, and then they're like, the science isn't real, and then that's why we have to eat, like, as natural as possible, so the carnivore diet is the best option for us because the pesticides and this and that, like, that makes you
Mhm,
even more sick, and then so that you can buy more medicine kind of thing. So,
mhm,
I think that's where the unknown kinda, like, enters into our mind, and then we start believing in these sort of things. We're like, "Yeah, it's plausible. Why wouldn't we wanna do
mhm,
that?"
mhm.
They can make money, and they nobody like, why would they care about me?
And that's like such a great point to make. And I'm really glad you brought that up because a lot of that fear messaging that we see online really is that like implying these are things that they don't want you to know. It's like, who's they,
Uh-huh.
right? Like, there's so much
Yeah.
nutrition, or like, there's so,
I love that. I
there's,
love those kind of ads,
yeah,
I'm sorry, but
who's
it's
they?
real talk.
Yeah.
They don't want you to know this, but, like, I'm like, "Who's they?" You know?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a dietitian, and I want my patients to know anything healthy about nutrition,
Yeah.
you know?
Well, I know, and it's like talk to any researcher, like they want you to know their research. They can't shut up talking about it. Like they're not trying to hide these things from you, right? But a lot of fear messaging I see online, like around nutrition stuff, specifically always cites like, oh, researchers are corrupt or they're clueless. And I want to drop
Mhm,
for our listeners here that there was actually a 2020 analysis done that on all like nutrition research throughout different journals and everything. And in their research, they found that only 13.4% of nutrition research had any type of involvement with the food industry or big pharma. And that included like the meat industry, the dairy industry, as well as supplements industry. So that really means, from the flip side, that almost 90% of the peer reviewed nutrition research in research journals, had absolutely zero ties to the food or supplement industry. So when someone is telling you that science is all bought and paid for, just know that that's not actually what the data shows and that the research itself is pretty sound. What happens in more of the issues that come from is people interpreting the research and misinterpreting the research and spreading agendas around that. Before we kind of moved into the next section, I wanted to just pose a kind of question that maybe we can sit with for a second, which is
mhm.
why do you think that fear based nutrition content performs so much better on social media than any of the like, here's what the evidence actually says type content? And what do we think that that tells us about how we consume our health information?
Are you asking this question to me? Because I have some response for this question.
Yeah, if you have responses, by all means,
Yeah.
tell me.
I mean, we of course, wanna hear from our listeners too. We wanted to look for the answers for these things, but I am just gonna dive in a little bit of a deeper issue, but I'm not gonna dive in. I'm gonna touch, but not gonna dive into a deeper issue. The level of nutrition education that we have, so the unknown becomes, like, fearful for us, And actually, in the Florida University, when they did this research, how the emotions can trigger things. So when we don't know something, that unknown can become very scary for us. They found in the research that this loss framed message can actually affect the way we perceive the message. So practically saying, when you give a fear-based advice to someone, so if you don't do this, this is something's going to happen to your health. For example, if you continue to eat seed oil, you might be having some, I don't know, some fertility problems. When you are thinking like this, and when you're someone who's suffering from one of those things, then you find yourself applying that to your life even more, because you're afraid that you can have that negative health outcome.
Mhm,
Whereas
mhm.
if you're angry, you are more on the gain frame. So meaning that when you are offered with something that should be in addition to your health, let's say if you add fiber to your diet, you can have better digestion, right? So that's going to work on those people better.
So, I mean, honestly, I really like that you brought up and talked about that study. So, it's kind of like when people are more scared about things, right? Like if they
Mhm,
are maybe having, like you said, a fertility issue where they're scared
mhm.
of like, "Oh my gosh, what if I can never have a kid? Like I really want a kid. I want to become a
It's a
parent."
value
And
of
then
yours, right?
yes. So then they're more susceptible to other kind of fear-based languages of, "Oh, the seed oils are toxic. They affect your fertility. If you stop eating them, you'll be more fertile." They're gonna be more
Mhm.
prone to being like, "Okay, yes, I'll listen to that." Versus maybe someone who's angry, who's like, "I'm so upset that my stomach always hurts," and they're angry, that they're gonna maybe be more susceptible for falling for messaging that's like, "Here, take this special supplement and balance all of your
Yeah.
GI issues," right? So then they're going to be more susceptible to adding something in, which is such an interesting way of framing it because I feel like you see both of those messages online all the time.
Yes. And sometimes, like, kinda intertwined with each other, right? Like, they
Mhm.
say, "Yes, this is bad for you. You should be incorporating, more of this particular, like, supplement, but it is
Mhm.
hard to get it through food, and here you are, and there is a supplement that
Mhm.
I'm selling for you, and here's a solution for you." I think there's also, like, a little bit of this clear direction in health,
Yeah.
because that's something that I see in the patients too, and I'm sure you've noticed it as well.
Mhm.
Like, when they come in, they want an answer, right? They're
Yep.
like, "So what do I eat? What do I eat to be
Mhm.
healthy? What do I like,
Mhm.
just give me the list of foods that I should be eating, and list of foods that I should be avoiding completely, and that's gonna be great." As a human beings, we are very creative, but we want just, like, one simple list, and then we just wanna be eating blueberries for the rest of our lives, and then
Right.
if I
Give me
eat
the
blueberries,
superfoods.
I'm just gonna be okay. I'm just gonna be okay if I eat just blueberries for the rest of my life, kinda thing.
Exactly. No, I would 100% agree with that, and I think when the world is so confusing, chaotic around us, right, we just are like, "I don't even wanna think about another thing, like, just tell me what to do." And I think it's so easy then for, yeah, people to fall into that way of thinking where even when they're coming to their healthcare providers, they're like, "Just give me the answer, tell me what to do." And as dietitians, that can be kind of frustrating sometimes because we're like, "Well, we don't want you to always have to come to us," right? Like, our goal is for you to be able to learn and apply this on your own. And
Mhm.
so we'll kind of help you, we'll educate you, but help you guide you into how do you actually make these changes consistently when
Yeah.
you're on your own, when you're not with us, right? But
Yeah.
yeah, I think it's such a interesting conversation to have around these things. But for the sake of time, where does this land us with something like the dietary guidelines, right? Because the guidelines in this case should technically be the antidote to like all of this confusion and noise that's online. Like there should be this like evidence-based anchor that helps us understand what is real, what's not, what's just fear mongering. And we're going to talk about what the guidelines have been, and then we're going to kind of jump into what has now happened to them.
I feel like with the recent popular events that occurred, people have a certain idea of dietary guidelines, but some people just met the dietary guidelines, because it
Yes.
wasn't this
Yeah.
popular before when they came out. We didn't see them on social media as much, you know.
Yep.
Nobody cared. Maybe you've seen a couple posts on LinkedIn, hey, dietary guidelines are out. Let's see. That was
Yep.
about it. But right now, the new shape, whether the shape of the dietary guidelines and whether the person who launch this new dietary guideline. Um, it became a little bit more popular this time, and we wanted to describe it to it. I'm glad that you actually, described it a little bit.
Yeah. So let's kind of give a quick little background. I want to spend just a couple minutes on this so people have an understanding of what the dietary guidelines are. So the dietary guidelines for Americans has existed since about 1980. It's updated every 5 years and it provides like a written outline of what the research is saying, what are the main policies or things that the average person may need to know in order to have a healthy diet.
Mhm,
The guidelines themselves have existed since 1980, but the USDA has had food guides that actually have gone started back in the 1940s as ways to be
mhm,
able to raise awareness for public health and nutrition concerns. But the process since the 1980s, how it's worked is that a dietary guideline advisory committee is put together, and this is usually a lot of professionals like researchers. One of my professors at the University of Minnesota had been involved in the dietary advisory committee before. So it's like professionals and people in their field. They review
mhm.
the scientific literature. It's usually like 2 years they spend. They review all of the literature, figure out what the science actually says. Do we have research that is conclusive? Do we have research that's maybe like it needs more research to answer? And then they produce a report with all of the scientific literature. Public comments are then taken. So people are in the public are able to review it. So like other dietitians are able to also review it and provide their comments on the guidelines themselves. And then the kind of the report itself. And then the guidelines are written from that.
So many different level of involvement, so like you
Mhm.
have the community, like the people who are actually working with the community are there. You have the researchers there. So it's like a multi-level thing and everybody's eyes are on it to revise and edit.
Yes, exactly. Kind of a slow bureaucratic process, but that's by design because it allows us to be able to ensure we're doing good and evidence-based work. And because these recommendations they impact a lot of people. So we want to make sure that the recommendations are solid and they're evidence backed. What's kind of concerning is that the RFK and the current administration when they went to create these new dietary guidelines, they actually took this report because there was already the advisory committee that produced a report. And what they did instead was they eliminated everybody that was kind of on this. He created his own panel of people, and then
Mhm.
they actually threw out almost half of the information that was in this report to
Yeah.
haphazardly and quickly create what these guidelines were, which we'll talk about in a bit. I'm not going to get too much into the weeds on that, but that's just kind of the difference that we're seeing on traditionally from the 1980s
Mhm.
to today. But kind of ignoring like all of the iterations of the food pyramid or food recommendations and hierarchies and whatever that have happened.
Well, the pyramid came in back in, like, 1992, so it wasn't, like, that old either. I mean, 4 years before I was born.
Yeah, so a lot of our listeners and viewers probably recognize the original food pyramid or grew up with it like I
Mhm.
did in school. That's
Yeah,
how what
I
we
did
learned
too.
was yeah, the little sugars on top and your base of carbs on the bottom. But I want people to know because I think a lot of people with this new kind of pyramid coming out think like, oh yeah, it's replacing this old food pyramid. But there was actually another type of image and a process of doing things that was between the old food pyramid and this one, and it was called MyPlate. So MyPlate had launched in 2011 and actually replaced that old food pyramid and was
Uh-huh.
the structure of nutrition education that we were using before this new pyramid dropped.
My plate is something that actually you could see in schools, which is very surprising to me that sometimes people do not really know what it is. So it was brought to the schools first, like you can see them in your school posters, but it pretty much tells you how your plate should look like. And then we call it my plate. Pretty much have your half of your plates with fruits and vegetables, and then the other half split but with between your protein and your carbohydrates. So you have one quarter with protein and one quarter with carbohydrate. So that's where your meals in high schools and then the middle schools were coming from if you went to high school or middle school between 2011, after 2011.
Well, and what's so cool with MyPlate too, I think you just showcased right there in the schools, they helped use it to kind of determine what a healthy meal looks like. And that was exactly what MyPlate was doing, right? It was replacing that old food pyramid. And instead of just giving these arbitrary, like random serving sizes, it actually helped people recognize what should a balanced meal look like. And what I
Mhm.
personally loved about my plate too is that it's so adaptable and it's flexible. It's culturally adaptable as well too. So instead of
Mhm.
just having images of certain foods that maybe people of a specific background might consume, white Europeans, we actually are including other sources of foods because we're saying here's like a quarter of your plate should be protein, right? And it's not just chicken or it's not just pork, where there's a lot of people in the world that don't eat pork. And instead, it just includes protein. And then it teaches you what a protein is and how to incorporate
Yeah.
that. And I loved that about my plate, that it was just so flexible.
Yeah, and I think it's important to know what you're eating, why you're eating too. And my plate kind of like opens the door for that when you think about it, because you have like
Mhm.
carbohydrates and protein listed over there. And then you start like thinking a little bit more like as like a bigger frame. Yeah, these are the nutrients that I need. These are the
Mhm.
macronutrients that I need too. And since 2011, I think society's awareness on the macronutrients has just gone very, very high up, like, especially
Yes.
right now with, like, oh, macro counting and whatnot, which I think sometimes it
Mhm.
gets to the obsessive level, but it is kinda nice to hear from people that they know about nutrients,
Mhm.
and I'm just,
Mhm.
like, wishing the same thing for the micronutrients. Some of the
Yeah.
micronutrients, they're becoming popular too with the recent things.
It allowed us to reject that all or nothing relationship with eating. It invited in more of that flexible thinking around our eating. So when it was flexible and visual, it left room for when we're not having a good day, or maybe when we're going to a party or doing all these like different things, right? We just go, how do we actually make our plate healthy in whatever situation that we're in? And so that's kind of the foundation of what my plate was. It was evidence based, flexible, visually intuitive. And now we kind of want to talk about what has changed and what that actually means. So,
Mhm.
the 2025 dietary guidelines have come out now, and will put like an image on the screen here so we can all see what the new food pyramid is looking like. It is, for our listeners, an upside down food pyramid. So if you can imagine, the big base is on top and the tiny little point is at the very bottom. So it is flipped on its head. And at the top, we're seeing protein and meats kind of on the left side, which include chicken, cheese, and a little bit of fish, some eggs, whole milk, whole fat yogurt, and red meat is very prominently on the top. Then on the right side, we have vegetables and fruits, where we have some like broccoli, tomatoes, carrots, squash, apples, berries, one bag of a frozen peas, and one can of some green beans. In the middle, we have, I'm guessing, some more fat sources. They have like a thing of olive oil, avocado, and butter. And then I have no idea. There's some nuts and seeds. No idea what that bowl of rice or oats. I have no idea. And at the bottom is your whole grains, where they have just some sprinkling of some oats, a bowl of something else, and some bread. So that is what we're seeing in the current new food pyramid. So, one thing I want to point out, we kind of mentioned
Mhm.
earlier that the
Yeah.
dietary guidelines, when they come out, they have an image, but then they also have a text document with it. So, the dietary guidelines are about 10 pages in total, one being the image and one being a message from RFK, and then the other eight being kind of information on the food pyramid. And if anybody has actually read through the text portions of this dietary guidelines, they will quickly see that the visual that's released with these guidelines do not actually match the entire story told in the written guidelines. And that
Mhm.
is concerning for multiple reasons, because public health messaging lives and dies on its visual communication. And if your image is contradicting your science, the image is going to win every single time.
Say, like, people don't
Yeah.
don't read the text, that you write, they just look at the images, and that's why, that's
Yep.
another reason why my plate has been working really well for us too. Well, I mean, honestly, when I look at this visual overall, I don't really understand how much I should consume what for starters.
Oh, agreed. That was definitely one of my first opinions too when I saw that, because I was like, "Well, like, this doesn't tell us anything about portions." At least the old food pyramid said how many servings you should roughly get of items, like, this doesn't even have
Yeah.
that, right? And I'm like, but the one thing that stood out to me a lot too is that like, completely eliminated any type of other sort of, like, cultural
Okay.
foods either.
I just want to take a side note. Old food pyramid, not to defend the old food pyramid at all, but old food pyramid was pretty much just telling us how should our calorie distribution should look like. That's what I
Mhm.
remember. I don't
Yeah.
think this represents this as much. Even old food pyramid represented something. When I look at it, I'm like, yeah, it makes sense. It was just showing how should your calorie ratio should look like. Which I'm not saying it was correct or it was a better way of communication, but at least it represented something.
Yeah. Well, and the old food pyramid too also gave you, like, the portion sizes where it said, like, 8 to 12 portion sizes of whole grains, and then it would be, like, 3 to 4 of fruit or vegetables, which we can argue about the, like, portion sizes of some of those items, but
Yeah.
it's, that it did give you kind of at least some idea, right, of how much to consume of these different foods. I also kind of get irritated by this too because it completely eliminated any sort of, like, plant-based protein sources in here too. And like
Mhm.
we know with
Yeah.
the current research that plant-based protein sources are actually just as nutritious and healthy too. But it's the inclusivity I think that bothers me the most about the new dietary guidelines is because inclusivity allows for more people to be able to understand like how to build a healthy diet or have a healthy plate because if you're seeing like an image of a guideline, right, and it doesn't apply to you, like it doesn't have any of your cultural foods or any foods that you eat on a day to day basis, you're just going to completely ignore it. Why would you follow it? Because you're like, well, this doesn't matter to me. Like, this isn't relevant to me or my food or my lifestyle or what I'm eating.
Cultural inclusivity is very important, but some of these benefits are coming from also cultural inclusivity too.
Hmm.
And I'm sure like hummus wasn't really a popular thing in United States, at some point, or some of the bean dishes, maybe they weren't like super popular or they didn't have the variety, but introducing that variety and sometimes it works for some of the like some people's palates, you allow people who are living in smaller communities to be able to actually get the benefits of those food products. Like beans, for example, just like you say, I'm gonna defend beans here because they're awesome. Because a couple of weeks ago, a couple episodes ago, when we were covering For the Love of God episodes, when we were going through that,
Hmm.
we've mentioned, how beneficial they are for being prebiotics so that it
Hmm.
allows us to produce short chain fatty acids and then have a healthier bowel fauna. So it is very important for everybody to be able to incorporate it. And honest to God, Rachel, I'm just going to be honest with my with our audience because come on, you guys, this is not my only thing. Where I'm also working full time. This is for the first time I'm looking at this, and you are right. We don't have any plant based protein sources. There's no
Yeah,
beef here. I'm
I
offended.
know. I
I am
know.
personally
I
offended.
I know. And one of the other things that bothers me too about this is going back to the pyramid hierarchy. And when you're putting foods in a hierarchy, like a pyramid like this, you're automatically telling people that some foods are better than other foods,
Than
right? The
others.
foods that I'm seeing on here, does that automatically mean chicken is better than like edamame that I don't see on here? Or is chicken better than eggs? And it creates this unhealthy kind of relationship mentality with food. This communicates
Yeah.
the abstract or the abstract hierarchy. And it doesn't help you, like you kind of were saying too, of being able to answer the question, what does a healthy meal actually look like on my plate? And that black and white thinking, the good or bad morality or the duality of food is just not healthy in any capacity whatsoever.
Kind of feels like, we have to rewire patients enough already because when they come in,
Mhm.
no food is good or bad. That's
Yeah.
how we kinda get it.
Yeah.
Food doesn't have morals, and we need to
Yep.
establish that with our patients because when you start
Mhm.
looking like having too much emotion surrounding food, which food can be something that we can have too much emotions around. When you have that, you need to kind of rewire the person a little bit in a way so that they can look at it a little bit more logical and have more
Mhm.
mindful eating behavior,
Mhm.
which so far found to be the gold standard in nutrition.
Exactly. Well, and that's what MyPlate solved like so elegantly. It eliminated the confusion, right? It gave you a plan to be able to apply in your
Mhm,
day-to-day life because you saw, oh, half my plate should be fruits and vegetables, quarter protein, quarter carbs, and all you're doing is educating on what fits into these categories. And then you can take that and apply that to your life and apply that to have like these better health outcomes. You're able to act on it, right? Because, like, let's be honest, if I took these two visuals and I gave a copy of my plate and a copy of this new food pyramid to a client, or even someone with no nutrition background whatsoever, like, which one do you think that they would actually be able to use in their day to day life? Like, one's actionable and one's not.
and actionable advice, always works with patients the best because that's what they come in, "But what do I do?" "What do I do?"
Hmm.
"Yeah, I know this
Hmm.
information. I know, like, yeah, I should be incorporating some of these, like, stuff, but how? Why? How much?"
Hmm.
So, the pyramid doesn't really give us that.
I did kinda wanna, like, jump into a little bit more, I guess, of the text side of the guidelines because we've just been riffing on the image. I think the first thing is kind of the focus on whole foods within this dietary guidelines. Like,
Mhm,
there's a lot of emphasis throughout, not just the image, but also through the whole text about whole foods and making our diet minimally ultra processed and predominantly just whole food items. And I
mhm.
will
Yeah.
celebrate that. I think every professional can agree that this is the healthy thing to do. But I do want to point out that that is not new. That has been the standard of practice for many, 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 many years already and was
Mhm.
included in the previous dietary guidelines of MyPlate to have a diet focused on whole foods. So that is not a new claim, but I am glad, I guess, that they kept it.
Yeah, well, it is good to celebrate bipartisan opinion, right? Like, unfortunately, we
Yeah.
are kind of divided, so it is good. Yeah, we all think that whole food is good. That's our common point, common ground.
Mhm.
That's awesome.
Other than the whole food focus, is there any other positives that you want to state right away before we just dive into the text?
I mean, honestly, when I read it, I kind of was like, seeing, of course, like some contradicting things. The
Mhm.
only thing that I was like, well, this makes sense, was the protein when I was reading it through. Of course, the saturated fat advice, I think it didn't change; it remained the same too. But protein, particularly, it was like, oh yeah, 1.2. I guess I don't really go up to 1.2 as much with my patients, but even though,
Mhm.
I think it wasn't 100% inclusive, by the way,
Yeah.
because it's not always the case. We can't always use 1.2 for some of our patients, but sometimes it really does work with some patients, like, we see
Mhm.
more like, increased satiety, we see, better results with some of the patients, but it is more personal, it's important to know, but getting 1.2 gram per kilogram per day, protein kinda sounded okay-ish, a little
Yeah.
bit okay-ish.
I think that the issue that I saw with the protein recommendations that it gave was one, they were a little bit high, like you're saying, 1.2 to
Mhm.
1.6, a little
Yeah.
high. Previously, we always said like zero point 0.8 grams per kilogram being like the base because that's just what's to prevent having malnutrition, muscle wasting, that stuff. So there's
Mhm.
arguing like there's ranges with protein, but that's the point that I have a problem with. It's a range. Like protein, I don't think you can just explicitly say here's the range that everybody should eat in because the
Mhm.
amount of like protein or individual nutrient needs that you have are going to be so individual to the individual person.
Yeah.
Like it's going to vary on your age, your activity level, existing diseases or chronic conditions.
Yeah, like, if you have some, like, healing situation going on, like, if you have wounds and whatnot, that's when we kind
Mhm.
of increase a little bit, like, cancer patients are different. So, giving this kind of
Dialysis. Yeah.
yeah, giving this kind of a
Mhm.
recommendation can definitely cause confusion, which
Yep.
contradicts with what we were saying about the dietary guidelines, right? Like, we were saying that it should actually reduce the confusion. It should
Mhm.
actually do
Mhm.
the opposite. Kinda makes you feel
Mhm.
like, "Yeah, I have a clearer direction right now."
Well, and also, like, how many of our American listeners out there know what a kilogram is? Do you know?
Yeah,
Like, we talk about pounds, right? As dietitians, we utilize metric system in our equations. So for us, like,
yeah.
this was nothing new to see. But when I
All
think
the
about,
science things.
yeah, when I think about even before I was in school, I had never used a kilogram in my life.
Mhm.
It's like pounds is what we'd use. And I can easily see this being misinterpreted, especially by those like gym bros to be, oh, we need 1.2 to 1.6 grams per pound of body weight. And no. But my
Yeah,
other
you need
issue
to.
too here is that even if you do that math, right? Like you figure out your weight in kilograms, do the math with this arbitrary range and figure out how much protein that you need, this still doesn't tell you what does that, like, say it's 100 grams. What does 100 grams of protein look like? How do we include that in our
Mhm.
diet? What's a portion of a protein? Like, what's going to actually get me there? It
Yeah.
doesn't address that. And with protein too, I did want to bring up the whole like you saw hit RFK's speech on the war on protein, right? With this.
Yeah.
And I just want to like just quickly say there is no war on protein. MyPlate previously explicitly dedicated a quarter of the plate to protein sources and listed a wide range of sources, not just meat, but
Yeah.
also plant-based sources like lentils and
Necessarily
soy.
it didn't necessarily give, like, maybe this kind of, like, numbers. Yeah, it was
Yeah.
kinda, like, representing protein, so proteins were also included in the My Plate too, as part of My Plate as well.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think the framing of there being like a war on protein, right, is a great example of like all that fear mongering that we were
Mhm.
talking about earlier. Taking something that people are already anxious about, like maybe muscle wasting or strength or keeping strength as aging, and then implying that an establishment's working against them. They don't want you to know these things. They're
Mhm.
suppressing these things, and then making it like a war and all these things. It just it's fear mongering, right? It's not true. And we need to be
Yeah.
really weary of whenever someone is framing things in a very fear forward type of attitude.
The next thing, after talking about protein, there are a couple more things that we've seen, like limiting the saturated fat. So
Mhm.
limiting the saturated fat to 10% can also isn't that also something that we already do? I don't understand
Yes.
why, it's like that, but at the same time, you have some added stuff on the list. I mean, you're already getting the saturated fat with some of the foods. So, like, there's these disparities. It almost feels like it's not really thought out. That's what it feels
Mhm.
like, It's like,
Yeah,
okay,
it's
you're
like the
recommending red meat, but at the same time, like, people are gonna get that 10% from there anyways, or with some of their dairies, but at the same time, you're adding beef tallow on the list, like, almost additional,
Mhm.
go get
Mhm.
additional, um,
Mhm.
saturated fat in the name of getting essential fatty acids,
Mhm.
I guess?
Yes, incorporate healthy fats section on the written guidelines. It specifically says, in general, saturated fat consumption should not exceed 10% of the total daily calories, and significantly limiting highly processed foods will help meet this goal. More highly qualified
Mhm.
or high quality research is needed to determine which types of dietary fats best support long term health. And like, this is not new. Like you were saying, I agree. Like, we should be limiting saturated fat consumption to less than 10%. However, like you also were saying, the image, all the protein sources that it lists in the image are high saturated fat sources,
Whole
high
milk.
fat dairies, whole milk, specifically red meats, especially things like steak. And we don't really know what leanness that ground beef is, but you can kind of assume it's probably not 93.7.
You
Like
have
all of
butter.
these and then butter, yes, butter. These are all sources of fat in the diet, and butter is a high of saturated fat. Olive oil is a mono unsaturated. It's not saturated, but butter is really high in saturated fats, right? If you're going to be
It is.
eating off of the image, you're going to be well exceeding that 10%. What's
Yeah.
kind of interesting to me too is that in the incorporate healthy fats section, it does say that when cooking with or adding fats to meals, prioritize oils with essential fatty
Mhm.
acids. And then it goes on to list olive oil or other options being butter or beef tallow. And I want to say, like, that is a contradicting statement already in and of itself because butter
Mhm.
and beef tallow and olive oil, none of those are sources of essential fatty acids. Butter and beef
Yeah.
tallow being high in saturated fats, like you were saying, but olive oil being a mono unsaturated fatty acid. It's not an
Mhm.
essential fatty acid.
But, I just wanna take a side note and let everybody know, like, Rachel and I both love eating, and I'm sure, like, look, I'm from Turkey, I love kebabs, and I love
Yeah.
beef tallow. This is not a war against, like, beef tallow, or this is not a war
Mhm.
against anything. The dietary guidelines should give you a clear guideline of, like, what the best eating looks like, but
Mhm.
unfortunately, as human beings, we aren't best. So you are gonna eat beef tallow, but it should not be on your guideline as, like, I
Yeah.
have to be eating a beef tallow, you know? Like, of
Yep.
course, as a human being, you're gonna, take a side. Sometimes you're gonna do something naughty, a cheat day. Sometimes people are talking about it like that, but, you
Yeah.
are gonna be able to eat high calorie foods, of course, and I'm sure that I would eat beef tallow if it was in a kebab or something, you know? I'll be just
Mhm.
honest with
Mhm.
our viewers or listeners over
Mhm.
here. But having them in a guideline is a completely different ball game, and that's what we're trying
Yep.
to recognize it because yes, as a
Yep.
dietitian, I know, and that's why I'm comfortable and I do not have too much emotion surrounding it, but a lot of people have mental health issues surrounding
Mhm.
nutrition. And when you have these
Mhm.
kind of information listed in your guidelines, then yeah, you are opening the door for a lot of issues, a lot of
Mhm.
public health problems or increase
Mhm.
in public health problems.
Well, and especially when you're putting, like, your recommendation as being one of your primary fat sources being beef tallow. Like,
Mhm.
that's
Yeah.
concerning. And going back a little bit to the essential fatty acids thing too, just to briefly kind of describe for our listeners and audience in general, that essential fatty acids have an actual scientific definition. So, what that means is that there are some nutrients that our bodies cannot synthesize on our own, so we have to obtain it from our diet. And essential fatty acids are one of those things. So there's types of fatty acids that our bodies can synthesize, and then there's ones that can't. So the
Yeah.
essential fatty acids that our body cannot synthesize that we have to get from our diet include omega 3 and omega 6. Both
Yeah.
of these are very critical for a lot of functions in our body, including our brain and nervous system function. So, olive oil, like I briefly mentioned, is a monounsaturated fat or primarily, which our bodies can produce. So, it's not essential. It's not a source of essential fatty acids. It's a fine oil. It does have real benefits, like it's okay to use. And
We
olive
love
oil
olive
actually does have.
oil.
Yeah, we do love it because it does have polyphenols. So that's an
Yes,
antioxidant and
it
that has
does.
its own benefits. It's great, but it's not an essential fatty acid. And I think that the guidelines putting it in the same category of saying
As
consume
like
oils with essential
essential.
fatty acids, such as olive oil, that's concerning because that kind of indicates, was there even someone with a dietetics background helping to assemble these guidelines? Like, they would have known that.
Some influencers maybe.
Yeah, probably. But I do want to point out too that if anyone's wondering, actual dietary sources for essential fatty acids include for oils, sunflower, safflower, soybeans, and canola oils. Surprisingly, all of those are known as what? Seed oils.
Yes.
Those are the very oils that, everyone kind of fear mongers, but they're actually really good for us.
Uh-huh.
They do provide us essential fatty acids, omega 3s and
Yeah.
6. But if you don't want to get them from your oils, you can get them from normal foods like fatty fish like salmon, as well as nuts and seeds.
Yes, absolutely. I'm glad that you kinda like, it doesn't have to be black and white, Maybe you don't wanna
Hmm.
use them as your cooking oil, understandable,
Hmm.
Go ahead and use olive oil as your cooking oil, that's totally fine. There are
Hmm.
some that are like, cold pressed ones, hot pressed ones, so that you can use them for cooking purposes, so it has, like, higher smoking points. Use them as your cooking oil, but try to incorporate these kind of essential oils in the form of food, and,
Hmm.
there's nothing bad about fatty fish. There's nothing bad about salmon. There's nothing bad about, like, nuts, if you don't wanna eat
Hmm.
seeds. There's nothing bad about nuts, so, you can incorporate those things and try to get your essential fatty acids from there.
Hmm. Well, for the sake of time, I do want to just throw out for everybody that it's worth kind of noting that the Center for Science and the Public Interest actually has produced an alternative dietary guideline that is based on all of the original scientific committee's works that were ignored by RFK and their panel that they put together. But they actually it's called the Uncompromised Dietary Guidelines for Americans, and I will link it in the show notes below in the description so that people can go look on that on their own accord. But it is a little bit longer of a document, but it gives all the research in detail of what should have been in our dietary guidelines. So now that we've kind of established that these dietary guidelines have some pretty real and specific and documented problems, I wanted to kind of zoom back out and talk more about the bigger argument here and kind of conversation that we're having this episode about, because the damage from the food fear based nutrition messaging isn't just about the bad guidelines. it has pretty real and measurable health consequences. And that's kind of really what we wanted to focus on today.
It's a little bit ironic to kinda look at this and then think that it's, in the name of promoting our health, we're actually feeling a little bit more stressful around food. So, there's a constant I know that I've been using or we've been using the seed oil example a lot today, but I wanna
Hmm.
just get in from there, as well, because now you're forced to go to the grocery stores and then kinda look and try to figure out, which food has the seed oils, and you should be avoiding it on top of every single stress that you're experiencing. Life isn't easy. We have to deal with like health problems. We have to deal with other issues on our day to day life. And in
Hmm.
fact, the psychological stress has been shown to decrease circulation in your coronary arteries, which means that it can increase the risk of myocardial
Hmm.
infraction. In other words,
Heart attack.
a heart attack, yes, that's a better way of saying it. And then other severe mental illnesses, it was, linked to the cardiac arrhythmias as well. So, in one hand, you think you're doing something nice, but by adding stress, avoiding that particular food group or avoiding that particular nutrient, then you increase your stress even more. Then that leads to other illnesses like heart attack.
Well, and that totally is the irony, right? Like chronic psychological
Mhm.
stress that the food fear creates poses this measurably greater health risk than probably even just occasionally eating that food that you're afraid of, anyways, right? Like,
Yeah.
we know the connection between the chronic psychological stress and onset of disease, including diabetes, cardiovascular disease, like you mentioned, as well as even cancers, is pretty documented across a lot of the research. And like research over the past several decades has clearly established this link. And when it comes down to it, is like dose is what really makes the poison. Like eating an ultra
Yes.
processed food or a fast food meal occasionally is not going to meaningfully alter your long term health trajectory. Like living in that constant state of anxiety about food, however, has a very real documented downstream effect on your cardiovascular system, your immune system, your metabolic health, all of those things. So, and this is kind of probably the most important thing that we're saying today in regards to
Yeah.
this topic.
There's also like the aspect of contributing to already existing problems and issues surrounding food, which
Hmm.
when you start kind of like labeling things as toxic or as poison, someone who already has some fear or phobia around certain foods, it can exacerbate other emotions. It can trigger other
Hmm.
emotions too.
And we're going to kind of briefly talk about eating disorders for our audience at this point. And we want to do it carefully because I don't want to like scare people with this. And I also don't
Mhm.
necessarily want to trigger anybody. But I do think it's genuinely irresponsible to talk about food fear and the culture around it without naming that it can become a pretty serious problem for some people. And this
Mhm.
is because eating disorders are not like a niche concern either. They're a very, very lethal mental health condition. And this
It is
clean
lethal.
eating pipeline is a very real documented risk factor for the development of many eating disorders. This cultural message that labels foods as toxic or poison or clean versus dirty doesn't exist in a vacuum. And, people who have like this psychological or biological or social precursors for developing an eating disorder can be really susceptible to these health claims.
Yeah, I wanna actually, like, give you an example of, like, a real events, but I remember this, like, one influencer who's decided to just eat, like, healthy or clean, whatever, and then was just eating fruits and vegetables, and then she just passed away from nutritional deficiencies. These are no jokes. Like, we think it's, like, an everyday thing, it's part of our lives, and that's why it feels less dangerous, but it can create a lot of other problems, and we've
Hmm.
touched base with malnutrition too, and then how it can affect other things as well. But I think one of the biggest things is it definitely affects the healing time, right? It brings your immune
Hmm.
system down. You are actually losing your power to kind of fight with illnesses, and you're losing your power to feel better and get better in a shorter term or
Hmm.
in a quicker term.
Yeah. Well, and that's a really great point because when you're looking at having this fear around food, it can potentially lead you to cutting out complete food groups too. Like if you're being told, "Oh, dairy's toxic or gluten's toxic," you're going to be cutting out large groups of food, and you may not necessarily know how to replenish and make sure you're getting the like calcium back in your diet if you're not eating any dairy, which could have impacts on our bone health. Or you may be cutting out
Mhm.
gluten and therefore you're cutting out a lot of sources of healthy carbohydrates and fiber, and like that can have its negative health effects on it. And when we talk about eating disorders, I know the ones that are most common that people recognize are things like anorexia or bulimia, but there is also kind of this fourth one, I should say, is becoming more recognized clinically, which is called orthorexia. And this is an obsessive preoccupation with essentially healthy, quote unquote, clean eating.
Well, I think it's right now called avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. Right now, that's the DSM-5 diagnosis for orthorexia. I'm not 100% sure, but it can cause
Mm,
problems, of course, once you start avoiding the entire food groups. I mean, you've mentioned about like gluten as an example.
hmm
There are some certain vitamins that we need from grains, for example, and someone who's healthy, who doesn't have any problems with gluten, is just avoiding gluten in the name of being healthy or eating clean or reducing inflammation, whatever you may call that, then they
hmm
may actually face some nutritional deficiencies, which can lead to more dangerous consequences than just feeling pure or clean, you know? Because, like, some of these terms, like, very vague. That's also
Yeah,
another
they
thing,
are.
too, with the messages, like with some of those messages. It's almost like focusing too much on what you have insecurity about, like something vague that you
hmm
have insecurity about, which
hmm
I think when it comes to our body, when everything goes wrong, that's the only thing that we have control over. And that's why it's so
hmm
easy to get obsessed over these sort of things too. So,
Yeah. Well, and like you said, it's so vague too. When you hear claims like, oh, don't eat this because it's inflammatory, like, what does that mean? How are we measuring that, inflammation? Like,
yeah.
chronic inflammation is a very real thing. It's involved in like autoimmune illnesses and heart diseases and diabetes, but it's a complex mechanism and biological like concept.
Mhm.
And just to throw out that word of like, oh, inflammation it really doesn't have any meaning when you're looking at it like that.
Yeah.
And like research has found that individuals who experience constant stress and anxiety and dissatisfaction with just different areas of their life are going to be more susceptible to turning to food and this illusion of having control over their diet as a coping strategy. So when we're seeing things on social media and internet culture that's like fear mongering or giving these kind of fear messages or very vague messaging, and trends that
Mhm.
glorify certain eating patterns while demonizing others, or even this like skinny trends that we're seeing pick up, like that's all can be very damaging because people that maybe are having stress and anxiety are going to be susceptible to believing this and then leading themselves down a path of restriction.
Yeah, and none of us immune to this, like,
Mhm.
when we go through some stuff, yeah, we all wanna have certain control over something. I think, for me, it's definitely the environment that I live in. I get obsessed over, like, I need to clean everything, organize everything, and everything needs to look like they're perfect. When I don't have control
Yeah.
over certain things or certain parts of my life that are kinda, like,
Mm.
crumbling. Yeah.
This is yeah, not good, not healthy. We all need to learn healthy stress management skills at the end of the day,
Yes.
right? And I kind of coming back to the conversation around eating disorders, I did just want to point out too that eating disorders are really concerning for a lot of different reasons, not only for malnutrition purposes, but they can lead to lots of different physical consequences like cardiac like heart complications, metabolic disruption, and they're actually considered the psychiatric disorder with the highest mortality rate. So,
Yeah.
kind of moving forward, we wanted to leave people with some quick little points on how do we actually determine what is evidence based nutrition or information that we're seeing online. There's just a couple little points here that we wanted to go through.
Yeah, one of the first things to know is make sure who is saying what you're listening, right? Like, who is this person? What's their credentials? Are they like a dietitian? Are they someone who's in a position that can talk about this, you know? That's one of the first things. Who is the source of the information? Where's that information coming from? Who is
Yep.
delivering that information to you? I think that's one of the most important things, especially when it
Mhm.
comes to social media.
Yeah, is it a registered dietitian or is it Joe Schmo from down the road that, has
Josh.
maybe lost 20 pounds and now thinks they know everything about nutrition?
Yes.
So I think the other, thing with this as well is that we can also verify, claims that people are making online too.
Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics has nutrition fact check.
eatrightpro.org/nutrition fact check is the main site. And they have
Mhm.
nutrition fact sections on raw milk, saturated fats, food dyes, seed oils,
Yes.
ultra processed foods, all of the above that you can click on. And it actually does look like it has articles for on the science around these different topics, as well as shareable and downloadable PDFs with the information about the item on there. So, yeah, all of those are great topics. We'll definitely link that below too for people who are interested in
Yes.
double checking some of those claims. So, that's great. And I think that kind of leads into our next point too is that nutrition isn't complicated and it doesn't have to be and it shouldn't be. So if someone is making it seem or make it feel very complicated, like saying you have
Mhm.
to follow these 20 different steps or eliminate these 50 different foods, that should be a red flag that this is likely fear mongering and not actual nutrition advice. And
Yeah.
so, fear of food is not a wellness practice. We have research that shows that fear and anxiety around food or just in our constant everyday life increases risk for disease states. So, being able to have a flexible relationship with food that allows for periods of pleasure and being able to like enjoy going out with people and it's a health outcome worth protecting. Like we that at the end of the day is really what matters.
Enjoy your life, enjoy your life, enjoy that birthday cake, and you don't really need to worry about just one slice of birthday cake giving you cancer or ruining your life. Your body is stronger than you think.
Well, and that's kind of what we want you to walk away with today from this episode is that the noise around food and nutrition has never really been louder than it is today. We see a lot of fear mongering online, but that's what it's for.
Mhm.
It's designed to make you afraid of food groups and what's on your dinner plate. And it's all just due
Mhm.
to like wanting to sell you something, or maybe it's just due to their own misinterpretation of
And
things.
it's a little bit of attention grabbing too, like, it's
Yes.
just important to remember when you make, like, this over the top claims, then you're gonna have more followers because people are gonna be
Hmm.
interested and to listen what you're about to say
Yep.
if you tell them that, it's toxic or it's poisonous.
Mhm. Exactly, but the evidence has been pretty clear here that balanced diets that are built mostly around whole foods, it's what moves the needle on long-term health. It's not having perfection or purity over, like, what we're eating and being clean or good and bad or whatever. It's just about having these healthy patterns that are really, like, 80% of the time, you know? And anyone making nutrition more complicated than that, whether it be an influencer, a wellness brand, or even a federal guideline, it's probably not your most reliable source. We want to trust the
Yeah,
research and trust the evidence, trust a registered dietitian, and most importantly, trust that food is allowed to be something that you enjoy.
yes.
And if you are feeling like anxious or guilty or feeling isolated around the way that you are eating, we do encourage you to seek out a licensed health professional that could help you explore
Mhm.
those feelings. Do you
Yeah.
want to add any last words?
I do wanna add this last words of saying, like, this is something that I share with all of my patients too. You do not need to eat something that you don't like in the name of, like, being
Mhm.
healthy, or you do not need to take off things that you like from your diet completely, again, in the name of being healthy. And, yeah, your plate might be part of your health, but so is your peace of mind, so you need to take care of both of them.
So we wanted to thank everybody for listening today. We really appreciate every single one of you that listens and follows along or gives us likes or thumbs ups or stars, all that jazz. So if you ever have ideas for future episodes, please leave a comment. We would love to hear that or any feedback that you may have. Otherwise, we will see you on the next one. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.